Welcome back to the book of Mark. We are coming near the end. We're halfway through the year. We've done all of Matthew. We're getting to the end of Mark. We've only got a couple more, which is really cool. So we are well and truly on track. Why don't you leave a comment or some kind of thing about where you're at the bottom of the thing. That'd be really cool. Let us know whether you're catching up, keeping up, you're a long way in front. But this the intro, 3 parts, and this weird ending to Mark, and we are at the third part. Now, the third part of Mark is really chapter 11 through to chapter 16, and it's all about the persecution, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus. That's really, if we could bundle it into a package, that's what this final part of Mark is about before we get to the weird ending. So it's all about like the suffering servant and the divine king. You're talking about the death and the life. You know, this is the whole kind of accumulation of the book of Mark. So it kicks off with the triumphal entry of Jesus. And we've spoken about this with Matthew. You know, you've got Pilate is entering Jerusalem one way with his imperial army, which is really what the Jewish people expected their Messiah to enter like. So you've got Pilate and the empire entering really in the way that they're expecting the Messiah to, but Jesus entering in on a donkey and coming in to Jerusalem that way. Really, because I think at the end of the day, what the idea was the Jewish people were expecting this king on a horse, sword drawn, going to take over the world, but Jesus was demonstrating what his kingdom was going to be, which is on a donkey, which is humility, kindness, changing the world. The least will become the greatest, and this kind of idea. He was demonstrating what it was going to look like. And then as he enters in, we've got this whole temple cleansing scenario going on. And, you know, Jesus is getting angry and he's flipping tables and all this sort of stuff. You know, the idea around this is really that what Jesus found was the corrupt system of the government, the corrupt economical system, the corrupt religious system the church was engaging in. You know, the church was meant to be this place that set people free. The church was meant to be this place that connected people with God. The purpose of the church was meant to be this scenario that went against this corrupt system. But what he found was that the religious sort of elite were engaged in the same power, the same economic, the same corruption that the world was in. That leads us to now chapter 12, where Jesus is starting to get a bit more pressure. There's a bit more sort of stuff being put on me. You know, he tells the parable of the tenants, and then after that, they're wanting to kill him. They talk about, you know, whose image is on the coin. You know, who do we pay taxes to? They're trying to trick him, you know, and Jesus does some clever stuff to put it back on them. Then the Sadducees, which were kind of like the religious kind of mafia in a sense, were trying to put Jesus in a bind over marriage and resurrection and really trying to get after him. And then he just got, you know, again, this kind of tricking him, trying to paint him into a corner around what's the greatest commandment. And it's kind of funny because it says after Jesus had dealt with all of that, nobody dared ask him any more questions. And so he decides he's going to poke the bear a little bit and really make them angry. You know, what do the experts say? You know, the women give 2 coins and she's given more than all the rest of you combined. You know, all this sort of stuff. Really, it's almost like he was engaging with the persecution, obviously in a loving and a kind way, but he was really challenging the system. He was really challenging the beliefs. He was really challenging the status quo. As we get to chapter 13 and 14, the conflict is just rising and rising, and Jesus is telling us that conflict is going to continue to rise. It's going to continue to get worse and worse and worse until it's going to culminate at AD 70 when the temple is destroyed and there are millions of Jews that are murdered and just wiped out. It was just a horrific season, a horrific time. But the crazy thing is there is no record of any Christians, any Jesus followers being killed. Why? Because Jesus had warned them what to look for and what was going to happen. And that's all around 13, 14, this rising conflict, this rising persecution, this rising problem that is coming in the current kind of era. And then, as I said, we get to chapter 14, and that's just all about Jesus, the plot against Jesus. You know, you've got the high priest, you've got Judas, you've got this whole plot to kill Jesus. So you can just see the tension is building, as we get up to the end of this chapter. As you can see, the whole temperature, the whole tension, the whole conflict is building and building and building as part of this last part of Mark's structure that he's talking about: the persecution, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus. Where it sort of starts to curve a little bit, where you start to see the resurrection side, is at Passover. You know, Jesus is really reinterpreting Passover in the way that he's kind of acknowledging the reality that just as the lamb was slaughtered for the Passover meal and the blood was put on in the shape of a cross, and death was able to pass over the Jewish people, so he was going to be the Passover lamb whose blood was going to pay the price of the sin so that the death could pass over. Jesus is starting to engage into the narrative. It's almost like the disciples are starting to see this tension build, this conflict build, this kind of the corruption and the kingdom all starting to converge, and it's starting to happen. And Jesus is starting to explain it to his disciples about that there is a new Passover, if you like. But where we're going to finish it for today, we're going to finish part 3 next week, is that at the arrest of Jesus. So after the Passover dinner, and I actually think the Passover dinner is really cool, because not only is Jesus kind of reimagining it, really I think a big part of it as well is Jesus is wanting to spend his last moments, or his worst moments, or the moments of struggle together with the closest people in his life. And so they go for a walk after dinner, they go for a walk to the garden, and that's where it really starts to, the proverbial hits the fan, so to speak, because this is the arrest of Jesus. And I'm just going to finish it here with 3 quick thoughts. The first thought that really impacts me, in no real order I guess, is that Peter was convinced that it was his love for Jesus that was going to be the saving thing, where it was always been about his love for us. Can I challenge us? Can I just ask us, let's never fall for that trap. Let's never fall for the trap of it's how much I love him. It is all about how much he loves us. That is what is going to hold us. That is what is going to save us in those moments of struggle and those moments of turmoil. It's the knowledge of how much he loves us. That is what's going to save us. The second thought would be this: prayer is so much more than about trying to change your circumstance. Prayer is more about changing you. When Jesus went into the garden to pray, the circumstance that he was praying over, none of that changed. What changed was his attitude towards it, his strength towards it, his faith and trust in God in this situation. Prayer was all about transforming his heart and his spirit and his perspective, and less about changing circumstance. So often our prayer can be all about a shopping list of all the things we want to change, when God's priority is about changing us, that we would live a transformed life. And then the third and final thing to think about would be this: the naked guy. All right, so at the end of this chapter, on chapter 14, I think, on the arrest of Jesus, it talks about this guy. We don't know, he's an anonymous guy, and he's running around with just his tunic on, and they want to arrest him, and they go to grab him, almost like the cartoons. They grab the tunic and his clothes get ripped off and he just runs off naked. And you go, why on earth is that in there? Answer: I don't really know. But what I do know is in Scripture, the nakedness is always been an idiom or a picture of what it means to be vulnerable, of what it means to be honest, a revealing of who you really are. If you think about Adam and Eve in the garden, that they were naked, it wasn't necessarily about their physical nakedness, it's that they were emotionally naked. They were vulnerable, they were honest, there was nothing hidden. And I think that's what a lot of that has to say about this naked guy scenario, that it's in those moments of stress, it's in those moments of struggle, when the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth are kind of facing off, and you find yourself in those battles and you're not sure what to do. I actually think they're the moments that reveal who we are. They're the moments that reveal what's going on. Are we going to follow Jesus in those moments, or are we going to follow into the kingdom of darkness, the light? Where are we going to? Because I really think it's in these situations that expose us, and not in a condemning way, but just in a revealing way. Maybe I wasn't quite as confident in that as I thought. Maybe my trust in God wasn't actually where I thought it was. I actually think it's these scenarios that really reveal to us where we're at and those areas that we need to work on. So with that being done, we are done. If there's any other thoughts you want to add it to the comments. Let us know where you're at, whether you're enjoying it. Other than that, we'll see you next week. Love you. Bye-bye.